to spend some time tonight talking about something that really is a little bit of a practical thing, although it does have to do with eternity. And I want us to think about Abraham's life. Abraham is a Bible character that we know a lot about, simply because God has revealed so much. And we do see numerous times that Abraham was called upon to make decisions, and he made them. Some of the decisions that he made were not good decisions. Some of them were, some of them were not. But what I'm thinking about when I look at that is that when you look at his life, your life is really like Abraham's, and that is that it's kind of a sum total of the decisions that you make. And I think you can really learn a lot by looking at Abraham. And as we end the lesson, we're actually going to the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes very quickly as we kind of summarize and bring things to an end. When I go and look at Abraham, mostly we think of the good things that Abraham did. We do occasionally put some emphasis upon the decisions that he made that simply were not good decisions. But for the most part, we look at those good decisions, and so we'll look at those first. Abraham is really referred to as the father of the faithful. And the reason is that many of his decisions expressed a tremendous amount of faith in God, the kind of faith that certainly should be present in our lives. In the 12th chapter, for example, in verse 1 beginning, we find that when Abraham was 75 years old, that he was told to leave his home and to go wherever God directed him. He wasn't told, it would seem, where he was going. It was told that he would go to a land that I will show you. And he went. And as a result of that decision, he became a very wealthy man. Now, how do I know that? Because God said so. In verse 1, now the Lord God said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Now, part of this decision that is really not mentioned a great deal at any point until later, at least the effects of it, and how God dealt with it, there's a part of that you sometimes don't notice. But God said two things to him. He said, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred. Now, in the process of time, he ended up having Lot, at least part of his kindred, with him. And God, really through his providence, led to that separation as well. But for the most part, he simply obeyed God, and he left his country. Now, I'll be 74 next Lord's Day, so I can kind of sympathize with Abraham. If I suddenly received some instruction from someone that I need to pack everything I had and leave, just take Pat and I, and we went and left all of our children and everyone here and all of our friends and all of our family, and we just simply packed up and we were going to leave and go somewhere that God showed me, I kind of understand how difficult that would be. Now, when Pat and I decided to move to South Carolina and I was preaching when I was 22, it was a little easier decision. Didn't worry about it so much. But at 75, I can guarantee you that it would be a lot different decision to make that Abraham was called upon to make. Now, in chapter 13, and verse 2 and 4, you find something that's revealed as a result of what took place. Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and gold, and he went on his journey from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai. Now, when you read down in verse 4, unto the place of the altar which he made there at the first, and there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So he prospered greatly. There's no question about that. So he made a good decision. God told him to go, and he was going to make of him a great nation, give him a land. And wasn't too many years later that we find that he has prospered tremendously, and that was a very good decision. And no question about that. In Hebrews chapter 11, perhaps the most important part of that decision, from the standpoint of whether it was a good decision or not, is the place that it put him in the eyes of God. You remember in the book of Hebrews 11, you have what is sometimes referred to as the heroes of faith. And Abraham is right up at the beginning of those in verse 8. Actually, I think he's the fourth person mentioned. Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place where he should have to receive for an inheritance, he went out not knowing whether he went. And so he's praised by God for that good decision. So not only did he become very rich, but he placed himself into good standing with God. Now let's look at this one. You know, a few years later, Abraham chose. He made a choice. There was a problem there in chapter 13, beginning there in verse 8, with the people of Lot, the servants of Lot. Lot had become a very wealthy person simply by his association with Abraham. And there got to be a lot of strife between them. If you've ever watched any Western movies, you realize there have been some tremendous cattle wars. Sometimes there were cattle and sheep wars. But the whole problem is this. You know, there's a line that people make sometimes, an expression that they use in the investment world that says they're not making any more real estate. Well, that's true. They're not making any more land. Whatever land is here is here. And so whatever decisions we make about that land, we can't look and say, well, we can build some more because it can't be done. So land is land. And so all of a sudden, they get into a position where they both become so prosperous that this land didn't have enough pasture and enough water to take care of them. And so Abraham had to make a choice. And his choice was, he said to Lot in verse 8, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If thou depart to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest out of Zoar. Very prosperous land. Now, when Abraham made that decision to Lot go wherever he pleased, I don't know, he probably didn't realize what an impact that would have on his life. Have you ever made a decision that then afterwards you look back and say, what if I'd made the other decision? You ever think about that? What if Abraham had made the decision, I'm going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, I don't know what the impact would be, and you don't either. But I do know this, that his choice to allow Lot to choose, and Lot choosing Sodom and Gomorrah, had a tremendous impact upon everything else that happened in Abraham's life from that point forward. Now, every decision you make in life is not generally simply a short-term decision. Lots of them end up being something that the impact of lasts for years and years and years. In Hebrews chapter 11, you have another statement made there about Abraham in verse 9. He sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise, for he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, when you read that, the one thing that I sometimes wonder about, and I don't know when I look at this decision that was made there, if you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, it's at least it's the southernmost extreme of anything that could have been considered a part of the land that was promised to Abraham. I don't really know if it was or it wasn't. But the interesting thing is he had built that altar at Bethel, and he chose to remain there. That's where he stayed. And he didn't go to the most prosperous place, but he rather allowed Lot to go there. And that looked, I'm sure, when people would look at that and think, boy, what a wise decision that was for Lot. He went to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it didn't end up being a wise decision. Sometimes we don't really look at all the facts when we make a decision, and that's the reason why we may not make the best one. In this case, when Lot was out there in that cave, having lost his wife, and both of his daughters were with child that were his, a product of incest, you sometimes wonder if Lot would have thought to himself, well, things would have been a lot different if I hadn't made that choice. So when you look at Abraham's choice, you have to realize also that Lot made a choice. And look at the difference in their lives because of the choice that was made, the choices that were made. And it's very interesting to consider that and to think of it. On paper, Sometimes, we hear that expression. On paper, it looked like Lot's was the best choice. It looked like the best land, the most water, the best grass. But in the final analysis, there were other considerations that made it certainly not a very good choice. Because you have to wonder, when Lot made the choice to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, do you think they were just an exemplary city? Their morals was just stellar? Do you think there's any possibility that that land became that evil that quick after he moved there? Don't you suspect that there were some telltale signs that Lot could have looked at and said, whew, this isn't a very good choice? So you stop and you think about choices, you have to consider Lot's as well as Abraham's. Then you think about Abraham. Here he made a choice, and it was kind of an interesting choice because of where it put him. It put him in the middle of the lineage of the Christ. He didn't realize it at the time, but it's like a lot of choices we make. We don't really realize at the time the impact that they may have on our life, but they had a tremendous impact. Lot ended up being captured, taken kidnapped, captive, or kidnapped, whatever language you want to use. In 13, there came one that had escaped after he'd been kidnapped and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, which he's trying to identify to those people what he's writing about, and these were confederate with Abraham. These were people that he had made friends with, and they were helping him out. When Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, it actually was his relative. Sometimes the word brother is used in the Hebrew language to speak of any relative, just as the word son. He armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Now he goes, and in verse 17, after he has, he's bringing them back, and he's been successful, he comes upon the king of Sodom, went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of, if I can't pronounce that word, of the kings that were with him, at the valley of Shaveh, which is in the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Abram, or Abraham, of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hands. And he, that is Abraham, gave tithes of all that he had. Now, it's interesting to think about that. Now, that decision that he made to go and rescue Lot led to him meeting Melchizedek and led to him paying tithes to Melchizedek as the priest of God. And you may say that's a rather insignificant event. Well, it really was not an insignificant event, because it was a part of God's eternal purpose which he purposed in Christ Jesus, and it was a means of God revealing who Christ was. Later, and a lot of Christians really don't like to study about it because they find it very confusing. Later in the book of Hebrews, there in chapter 7, the writer of Hebrews refers back to that event and tells you the significance of it. He says, beginning there in verse 9, and he's talking about the Levitical priesthood. Well, who were they? Well, you had Abraham, you had Isaac, and then you had Jacob, and then you have the sons. So they would have been the great-great-grandchildren of Abraham, if I'm figuring that correctly. Maybe I'm leaving a great out. But anyway, a part of his ancestry. And when you look at them, what he's saying here in a symbolic way, Levi, also, who receiveth tithes, Levi is the priest under the law of Moses, but they paid tithes in Abraham. To whom? For he was yet in the loins of his father. Now, well, he hadn't been born yet, but at that time his fathers before him, when Melchizedek met Abraham, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there's made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man giveth attendance to the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident For that after the similitude of Melchizedek there arises another priest. That was Jesus, who was made not after the law of carnal commandments, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifieth, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. If you think about it, Abraham offering tithes or paying tithes to Melchizedek would not have happened had he not decided to go and deliver Lot. And you may say they're not really tied together. Yeah, they really are. Because that decision led to something that he didn't foresee. I understand that. But something that had tremendous impact on his life. Now, I don't know about you, but I can tell you this for sure. Pat and I sometimes sit down and talk about it. About some of the decisions that we've made and the tremendous impact they've had on our life. And you probably the same way. I mean, we sometimes need to realize that when you're making decisions, you can't take it lightly, because every decision you make may have long-lasting impact on your life. And that was true of Abraham, and it's a good lesson to learn simply by reviewing these various things. Let's look at one more. When God commanded Abraham to offer his son, Isaac, I'm sure, I don't know, when you stop and you think about this here in the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis, when Abraham heard this command, can you imagine how his reaction? It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, or test him, tested his faith, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I, or here I am. He said, Take now thy son, that only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee to the land of Moriah, and offer him for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Now, I want you to stop and think a moment about that. I know we often impress the fact, he said, Take your son, your only son, whom thou lovest, to show the difficulty of it. But let's think about the confusing nature of this. How long did Abraham wait for that son? You ever think about that? 25 years he waited for that son to be born. He was promised that at 75. His son wasn't born until he was 100. He went 25 years. And during that period of time, there were a lot of events that happened that kind of demonstrated he would get a little antsy about this by the time he came to the end. One of which we'll talk about when we talk about his bad decisions. So you got to look at that, and you kind of wonder if Abraham, like some people would say, Are you sure, Lord? Are you sure that's what you want me to do? Are you positive that you want me to do that? You know, the interesting thing about Abraham's faith that I've talked about so many times is what's said in verse 3. God told him to take your son, offer him as a sacrifice. There's nothing said about Abraham's response except one thing. He rose up early in the morning, saddled up his animal, and took 2 of his young men with him, and took his son, and clave the wood, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. No questions asked. Now you think about that. You just think about that. If you're a parent and you have a child, you understand what being involved in that. Say, I want to offer that son as a sacrifice. No questions asked. None. Didn't say to the Lord, Lord, you promised me this for 25 years, and I faithfully waited, and now it's been fulfilled. Didn't say any of that. Didn't say, Are you sure, Lord, that's what you want to do? Did I misunderstood? Did I mishear you? None of that. He just simply rose up early in the morning. You know what's interesting? That later, James talks about that. James absolutely talks about that particular event as he discusses Abraham. And what he says there in verse 21 is this. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered? Now notice what he said. When he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar. Let me tell you something. Some people say that was kind of a misstatement. No, that wasn't a misstatement. That's a factual statement. He did offer his son. God chose to provide another sacrifice. I understand that. But that wasn't Abraham. That was God. He offered his son. He got him. 17 years old at the time. That's hard to imagine. And what's really hard to imagine is how, you got at this time, a 117-year-old man, you got a 17-year-old boy, and without the boy's cooperation, unless Abraham was kind of a marvel of science, that would have been kind of a difficult project. But anyway, there's a lot of things involved in that really demonstrate everybody's faith in that situation. But the thing that's so important is to look at, he did offer his son. He said, "Seest thou have faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect." And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Now, you think about the consequence of actions. As a result of that action, he is called the friend of God. You see then how that will work. A man is justified not by faith only. Interesting thoughts to think about that. You start thinking about decisions you make. Some of these Abraham didn't understand the repercussions of. I understand that. Didn't realize what was actually going to take place as a result of it. I understand that. Neither do you. But making good decisions always has a good ending. I guess that's really kind of where you're going in that particular study. Now, let's think about this, though. Let's look at the bad ones. Now, everybody just thinks Abraham made only good decisions. Well, that's not true. He made some bad ones as well. We don't have time to review his whole life in this short period of study, but we're going to look at some of the most significant ones. You know, in the 12th chapter, there's something there that sometimes escapes us, I guess, and that's this. In the 12th chapter, beginning in verse 10, there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Let me ask you a question, and you think about it. God told him that he was going to give him a land to possess that he would show him. He had already carried him there. He had showed him the land. He had already settled there at Bethel. He had already built him an altar there, and he already began to worship God there and established, as we might say, a permanent residence. Now, what I don't see in this is, I don't see in this that this was something that God directed him to do. Now, if he did, that would be a secret thing that belongs to God. But as it's revealed, it just seems to say that Abraham decided the famine's bad, I'm going to go down to Egypt. Now, that's a hard one to decide if that's the way it was. But that's really the way it seems. That he decides he's going to go to Egypt, which really suggests that there might have been a little bit of problem with his faith. Because after all, God had promised him, I'm going to give you the land, and it's going to be prosperous, and I'm going to give you a people to possess it. But Abraham leaves it. And he goes down into Egypt. And what he does when he gets there is interesting. In fact, before he got here, it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt. Now, they're not there yet. Nothing has happened yet. He's making a preemptive strike, I guess you'd say. He says to Sarah, his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore, it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me. Now again, think about it. You're talking about a man of great faith. But he's like all men. He's still a man. And he began to doubt. After all, if God has promised that he's going to make of him a great nation, he doesn't even have a child at this time. There's no way that he's going to die. He doesn't have the child of promise at this time. There's no way that he's going to die if he believes God's word to be true. But he decides, and he tells her that, hey, they'll kill me. Never mind, God says he's going to make a great nation of me, and he's going to give me this land to possess. Never mind that. These people are going to kill me. And so he made a decision. We're going to lie to these folks, and we're going to tell them that, in fact, you are my sister, so that they won't kill me. And he was right. When he got down there, the Egyptians beheld her, and the princess basically said, the best women in the country ought to go to the Pharaoh, and she's one of them, and she's going to be. That's basically what they said, according to verse 15. But think of why this person was put in jeopardy. You know, this king of Egypt almost lost his life because of what took place here. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened here. You look at the Lord plaguing Pharaoh in his house with great plagues because of Sarah. And then when he calls Abraham before him, he said, What is this that thou hast done to me? Why didst thou not tell me she was my wife? And he goes on to say, that I might have taken her to be my wife, and that would have been a tremendous sin. So he almost lost his wife because he lied to the king. And had it not been for the intervention of God, he would. That wasn't a very good decision, to decide that I don't trust God to make me a great nation and give me many descendants. I don't believe that. I'm going to die. And he made a decision based upon that assumption. And later he made a similar decision. You know, sometimes you think about it. If you make a mistake, that's one thing. When you repeat the mistake, you know, and you already kind of know and understand everything because it's all been laid out before you, you've already been down that road, it's hard to imagine that Abraham would have made the same mistake again. But he did in chapter 20. He journeyed from thence to the south country, and he goes down there, and he says the same thing again to the king there, Abimelech. She is my sister. But God came to Abimelech, and the king sent and took her. So this time it went that far. And you see that Abimelech has a dream, and God says, behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman that is taken, for she's a man's wife. And Abimelech had not come near her. And as a result of that, God was able to restore her to Abraham. But just think. You know, you've got two decisions that were exactly the same decision, and they were both wrong. He'd already been shown the first time how wrong it was, but for some reason he made the same decision again. Now let's think about it a little bit. He then had probably was one of the biggest bad decisions he ever made. Maybe the biggest. I don't know. Hard to classify things such as that. But there's no question it was a bad decision. His wife decided that because of her age, you know, most women in their 80s and 90s don't have children, and she didn't bear many children. But she had a handmaid that belonged to her. Her name was Hagood. And Sarah says to Abraham, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. Even though the Lord has promised you're going to have a child, I'm not going to. I don't believe it. It may be that I may obtain children by her. So Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarah. A very common practice at the time. Polygamy was common. So he took another wife. In the eyes of the people, it had been no big deal. Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Caney, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now, she did bear a son, and in verse 15, Hagar bare Abram a son. Abraham called his name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael, and Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. So it's interesting. You think about that, and you look at this thing, and you realize what a bad decision that was. But I'm going to tell you, this was a decision that I suspect caused Abraham a lot of sleepless nights. A lot of sleepless nights. Let me ask you something. You ever watch TV shows that have to do with people who have children that are adopted, and then later they get to wondering what's happened to them? There used to be a show that came on, can't remember the name of it. Pat and I watched it a lot, where this guy would actually make his living going and finding those people and reuniting them. Because they just had this, that's my child. And I made that decision, and what's the result of that? How did it come out? We don't really know. I wonder how Abraham felt about that. Because when we look over to chapter 21 and verse 12 through 14, you find that he was called upon to give up that child. And God told him to take the son of the bondwoman, and he's not going to be a part of your family anymore. So Abraham rose up early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, gave it to Hagar, put it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And then, of course, we go on to talk of the events that took place. But I wonder about that decision. You think about it. When Abraham is called upon to give up that child, You reckon it never occurred to him why he was in that position? Why was he in that position in the first place? Why was he in the position of having to send Ishmael away so that he wouldn't inherit with Isaac, which was the child of promise that God had promised? Why? Because of the decision that Abraham had made to follow the advice of Sarah and take Hagood to be his wife and to bear up a child, to provide a child that she thought God didn't have the ability to provide. That's pretty much what it boiled down to. That doesn't sound good, but that's what it was. So Abraham now is kind of reaping the rewards of the decisions he's made. Now let's kind of think about what kind of lessons we learn from this. Now, what do we learn from it? You know, we have to always remember that whatever decisions you make, they'll often have long-term consequences. Decisions are not things that just whatever happens today stays today. That's not really the way life is. In the Book of Ecclesiastes, there's a passage that is really kind of amazing to me in the way it's written. We don't spend a lot of time discussing it, but it is an interesting passage. We kind of put our emphasis on parts of it, but we don't really put it together very often, so we see the entire picture. In the 10th chapter, in verse 18, he starts talking about decisions. That's what he's talking about. By much slothfulness, the building decayeth. It'll fall down because you don't maintain it. And through idleness of the hands, the house droppeth through. Then he goes on to say this: a feast is made for laughter, and wine maketh merry. That's kind of where our world is at the present time. But money answereth all things. And he's not suggesting that we need to be caught up in making money. But what he is saying is that, you know what, if you decide that you want to party all the time and not make a living, you probably have some sorry repercussions out of that, and your life will probably be a mess because of it. That's kind of what he's saying. Then he said this: curse not the king, no, not in thy thoughts, and curse not the rich in thy bedchamber, for a bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter. I heard Phil Valentine say on his show one time, and he was talking to his sons, and he said to them, because we have social media everywhere, and people get in trouble all the time about what they say on it. And he said to his sons, he said, you need to understand that whatever you print on social media, you just might as well go downtown and rent you a billboard and print it on a sign. Because whatever you are told about what's private is false. It is not. There's no way that any of that stuff is private. You telling me that it can't be accessed and it won't get back to a port that you don't want it to be. How many times do you see it happen? And so what he's telling you is you have to be really, really, really careful about decisions that you make. And he continues. He says, cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Now, you always interpret that to be good things. But remember, he said that these chapters don't have chapter and verse distinctions in the original. So what you've been reading in verse 10, verse 18 through 20 of chapter 10 is actually, this is just a continuation of this thought. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. But then he goes the other way. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and the tree falleth toward the south and toward the north. In the place where the tree falleth, there it shall be. But then he says this: he that observeth the wind shall not sow. In other words, we don't know everything, so we have to make decisions, and we have to try to make the best ones. But we can't really be deterred by what we don't know. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. As thou knowest not what is in the way of the Spirit, nor know the bones that do grow in the womb of her that is with child. Nowadays we do know a lot of that, but they didn't at this time. Even so thou knowest not the works of God who maketh all. In the morning sow thy seed, in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. Now, he's not suggesting that you pay no attention to anything and just run headlong and just act foolishly. That's not what he's suggesting. Decisions need to be made with a great deal of thought. But at the same time, realize that you don't really know always what the conditions are, what the situation is. You make the best decision you can. And that's kind of what he's got in mind. But I tell you what Galatians chapter 6 tells you. Galatians chapter 6, in telling you what this passage is talking about a little bit, it says this. You know, we have to understand that what we do in life, it's going to come back to haunt us sometimes. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing. Sometimes we get just disgusted because we think nothing's ever working right. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. When you look at Abraham's life, you realize he made a lot of decisions that affected him. When you look at your life, you know the same thing. I mean, tell me that's not true. Just tell me that you don't sometimes sit down and get to thinking about things and the things that you've done. Some of them you regret greatly. Some of them you're so glad you did. That's kind of the way Abraham would have been. There were some things he's really glad that he did. There's some things that he really wished he had not. Now, let's take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Proverbs for a moment. These two passages, these few passages in these two books are really interesting to me. In Proverbs chapter 14, in verse 29, and the word that's the kind of the key word here is the word hasty. And it means that you don't give much thought to something. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Most of the time, when we get very angry, whatever we do, we're not proud of, and we don't want to write home to Mama about. That's kind of what he's telling. In the 21st chapter, there, in verse 5, he says this. The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness. Diligent, meaning people that pay attention to what's going on. But of everyone that is hasty, only to want. Now you think about it. Again, he's talking about decisions, and he's saying, do you weigh the things very carefully? You try to make the best decision you can? Is that what you do? And then again, in chapter 29, in verse 20, the writer uses that same word again and talks about the same principle when he says this. Sayest thou a man that is hasty in his words, there is more hope of a fool than of him. That's a pretty straightforward question, or statement rather. It's an interesting question and a straightforward answer. And then, when you go over to the book of Ecclesiastes, there are actually two references there. Remember, the same man wrote these two books. It's the same author. In chapter 5 and verse 2, he said this, Be not rash with thy mouth. Let not thine heart be hasty to utter things before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth, therefore let thy words be few. Now, what he's saying there is that you need to be careful. Sometimes Jesus talks about words that are really words that are pretty meaningless and that we'll be judged by them. Things that we consider to be just minute and they don't matter. You ever think about decisions you make sometimes that are minute, that have tremendous impact as you go down the road? And that's the same point that's made here in chapter 5 and verse 2 when he said, just remember, be careful about what you say. And understand that you don't control all things. And so when you say things, just kind of be careful as you're speaking. And then in chapter 7 and verse 9, he says this, Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. In my lifetime, I've been present at two real fights. I've seen some minor skirmishes where people fought a little, but I've seen two real fights that make me a little skittish when people kind of get into it, because I've seen what can happen when, bad things happen. Both cases, the person that almost got killed in both situations was a person that pushed the issue, insisted upon a fight, because they were so mad, they didn't see what the end result was going to be. Well, that's what he's saying. He's saying, seldom ever does anger lead you to make a right decision. Almost never does anger lead you to make a right decision. Now, it might occasionally, such as when Jesus went into the temple, righteous indignation, as you sometimes refer to it, but most of the time, if it's just plain, we just get mad, we usually just don't do the right thing. So we get to think about that. We have some real lessons there. You know, this is another lesson that's kind of like a lot of them. I ended up in a different place than I was intended when I started. But the problem with Bible study is sometimes we have something in our mind that we want to show. And when we get started, we kind of see that God has something there that needs to be shown that we might not have thought about. And so when you look at Abraham's life, and I began to think about it, the more I considered it, I thought, you know what? We make a big mistake sometimes because we only look at one side of that. We only look at one side of that. Now, I realize that Abraham eventually was saved. I understand that, and I can say that with some confidence because of Luke chapter 16 particularly. And so I don't have any problem with that. But I understand that the Bible addresses two things. The Bible addresses salvation. The Bible addresses the fact, too, you live here upon the earth and what it'll be like. I often look at Paul and I think of 2 Timothy 4 and talk about the time of my departure at hand. How I'm looking forward to that crown of life. But I also remember the times that he spake of himself as the chiefest of sinners. And I know I've said it many times, but I can just see Paul lying awake at night and remembering what happened with Stephen. I can just see it. I can see that Abraham, as he went through his life, as he looked back at the decisions he made, there's some of them that I will guarantee you that had he made them to make over with the information that he had and had the strength of faith to do it, he would not have made that decision. Your life is the sum total of the decisions you make. So make good ones. That's really the truth. That's kind of what you learn from that. And you look at some principles that are stated that kind of help you in that direction in this particular passages that we've been reading. I know this is not a first principle sermon. It's, on Sunday night I usually try to preach sermons that really have more to do with those who are Christians and have more to do with those who are mature, because I kind of know that folks who come once a week really don't have the same interest perhaps as you do. And so I try to tailor it in that direction. And hopefully the lesson will be of somewhat of benefit to you. It's been a benefit to me just studying. Hopefully it's been a benefit to you. We're going to think about this song. If we need to be obedient to God, that is a decision we make. I often tell people there are two decisions in life that will have the most impact upon you than any other two things you'll ever do. Whether or not you obey the gospel and who you marry. Those are the two biggest decisions you'll probably ever make. They'll have more to do with your life than almost anything else. And we need to give that some consideration as together stand as we say.